This episode of The Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
Today we're going to bring you a different take on an Essentials episode. Many of the other shows on the network do this, but we're going to do it from a socioeconomic standpoint. We are going to look at the episodes in a chronological order, but backwards. So we're going to start with Voyager Season 7, work our way all the way back to Enterprise. When series overlap each other, we're going to jump back and forth between the series just to see the contrast in the two styles. So, for example, one of the episodes we may use in this episode would be Critical Care, which is an episode we've already done a full episode on. However, in this episode, we would just give you the point of view that we are trying to express, the key points that point that out in the episode, and then move on to the next person's list. We have not seen each other's list beforehand, so these are complete surprises to us. We probably won't have too much overlap, but you never know. And we'll see how it turns out. What do you think, Guinevere?
Yeah, exactly. I'm really excited about this. And I've also suggested that we think of socioeconomic or social science topics or ideas first and then connect them to the episodes. So I have a little list of ideas about social science things that come up in Voyager Season 7, and I'm really excited to talk about them and connect them to different episodes. So even I might have 2 or 3 episodes that touch on one topic. So I don't know if my list is going to be anything like your list, but I'm excited to find out.
Sounds great. So I guess we should start with, what is your first episode?
Okay, or my first social science topic. Well, so my first social science topic is the invisible hand, which almost everyone has probably heard of. It's Adam Smith's idea, the invisible hand. And I have one episode that that to me is very interesting for this topic, and that's Critical Care. And we've already had an episode on it, but we didn't really discuss how it connects to the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand. So shall I tell you a little bit about the invisible hand?
Absolutely.
Great. So Adam Smith is most famous for this idea. It comes from his book, The Wealth of Nations. But he also, he talks about this idea a lot, not necessarily always using that term, but that's the term that economists have jumped on and used. And it essentially means that it's like there's an invisible hand guiding people when they use market when they use the market, when they use private property in a society and, for example, seek profit and have self-interest, an invisible hand is guiding them to bring about a better society. And he talked about this because at the time, during the Enlightenment, he was trying, a lot of social scientists at the time were trying to explain how society could work without an overarching church or feudal system or another kind of authoritarian system. How could the society exist without this? And so he believed in virtues, in morality, and so forth, but he didn't want to have a society that was constrained by the church to force it to be good. He wanted people to be able to be more free and still have a good society. So Adam Smith explained in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, about how the the morality of the people was very important. The way that people interacted with each other was very important to keep a good society. And in that, he explained how that can exist and people can keep a check on each other essentially through their morality without the church. And in The Wealth of Nations, he explained how the market could also help the people to bring about a good society. So the invisible hand would guide people when they sought profit, would actually guide them to help society by serving the customer well. So it's a great idea and it's actually taken on later by Austrian economists, a school of economics that I've mentioned in previous episodes and will continue to mention. And so Hayek of the Austrian school explained how spontaneous order is, it's the sort of the complex adaptive system that is the market. And in his theories, he sort of takes on this idea of the invisible hand, but brings it into a kind of a more modern era with connecting it to things like complex adaptive systems theory, which compares markets to other complex systems like biological systems, like ecology, for example, and even the biology of the human body and so forth, and explains how you can't use physics to understand economics, using equations and things that physicists use, but you have to compare it to other complex systems. And so it's quite an interesting complex theory, but in any case, the reason that I connect this to critical care is because in critical care, if you see it as a metaphor for a market system in healthcare, it doesn't actually produce the beneficial outcomes that the ideas like the invisible hand or the spontaneous order theory would necessarily expect. So it's actually interesting because in some ways it shows the flaws in those theories. Because as we talked about in the episode on critical care, even though you could see it as describing a planned system, it's also a perfect metaphor for a market system in healthcare. Does that make any sense?
Right, absolutely. One of the things that is brought up in critical care that's maybe not addressed in that theory in general is a monopoly, because on that planet, that system, that healthcare system owns a monopoly. It can decide what it wants to do because there's nowhere else for you to go. So you as a consumer have no way of bargaining a better deal for yourself. So it doesn't really take into effect. The invisible hand doesn't matter if I can just tell you no, and there's no repercussions for me doing that.
Right. But if you see the episode as representative, as a metaphor, you might think that, either it's not a very good metaphor or there's something else kind of being explored there. And I think like in healthcare, there is kind of a monopoly. I mean, if you live out in a rural area, you may not have a choice. And also you may have a choice of different, say, insurance providers, but you may not if there's really only one place to go, if there's only one hospital to go to and, your insurance providers all treat you the same way because you have a pre-existing condition or something like that. So you might you might be essentially facing a monopoly provider in healthcare. And I think if you look at it as a metaphor, as we did in our episode on critical care, I think you can see how that does kind of match up to what we see in a lot of market-based health, or at least in the market-based healthcare system that you have in America, which is, to be fair, not much of a free market at all.
No, it's absolutely dictated by insurance companies and the likes. Because even if you do have health insurance, they basically tell you where you can go, and then there's not much you can do to get a better deal out of that anyway. And that's not even taking into account how you get your medical insurance in the first place. But we went over a bunch of that in that episode. So
yeah, sure.
We shouldn't delve too deep into that one. But it is true that the invisible hand theory doesn't really apply in all markets, which is kind of the problem with all theories, is they all believe that they work for everything. And there's really not a system that's ever worked that's in either one of the far extremes.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that you say that. I think that's exactly right. And I think, that it's I think that's why I like it as a metaphor, because it does kind of help you look at this theory and see in what way it might not work in all cases. And You're right. It is a lot to do with monopoly. But it's just interesting if you think about that theory, if you have that sort of theory in mind when you're watching the episode, and you can kind of, like you said, we shouldn't go into too many details now, but if you think about that while you're watching the episode, I think you can kind of see how the metaphor connects to the theory and how the theory doesn't really apply in this case. And then you can kind of think about why. And I think monopoly is a good answer to why in some sense, but you might even find other reasons or other ideas as to why it doesn't work, I think, while watching it.
You can also extrapolate that out and look at why a certain system might appear to be free when it's not for the consumer at all. Or when you have a system like the UK's where it's government-based and they provide it for everyone at one time, how that system actually works better because while there's only one insurance company, all the doctors are going to accept it. They don't have a choice.
Yeah. And also because if you do have a sort of a natural monopoly, you want that, you accept the fact that it's not going to be a market system, and then you can put either checks and regulations on it or have mandates for them to treat people the same and so forth. You have to economists have come to understand that even if they believe that markets and competition is the best way to go, there will be cases where you have a quote unquote natural monopoly. And in that case, you have to kind of give in and say the market system's not working. So we can, add some extra regulations and government oversight and so forth to make sure that you're being treated well. Because if you have a monopoly system in a free market and you don't have those checks, then the monopoly person can exploit you, which is kind of what you were saying.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay, so what's your first idea or episode?
Okay, so I went in a totally different direction on our first episodes, and I cheated with my first episode as well. My first episode is actually 2 episodes, and it starts in season 6. So,
I know what you're saying. Yes.
So mine revolves around revolution and the idea of rebellion. So,
interesting.
Unimatrix Zero is the seeds of a rebellion inside the Borg Collective. It's interesting in that when we first meet Unimatrix Zero and the inhabitants of Unimatrix Zero, they don't actually remember that they are rebelling against the Borg when they come out of their regeneration cycles. So it's kind of like they're dreaming of rebelling, but they don't remember it. So there's a couple interesting things. Like I said, I kind of cheated. I used 2 episodes, but it technically happens in season 7. Mm-hmm. And the really important parts happen in season 7. So I'm going to count it for me.
Yeah, I think we can give you that one.
Yeah, so it works for me, right? I'm allowed to cheat once in a while. I actually left something else off my list because it would have been cheating twice. But so with this, what I like about this is you have this group who's finding covert places to meet, which is Unimatrix Zero when they go to the regeneration cycle, and the Borg is so threatened by this that they're actually sending drones into Unimatrix Zero to annihilate these drones that are malfunctioning. They are so upset that they must quell the uprising any way possible. As we go through the 2 episodes, we find out that Seven was a part of this from the very beginning, which kind of they throw in there so that it explains why she was able to get her humanity back so easily, in the long run.
Maybe. You could see it that way, I guess. But
she was part of this, and
but anyway, she was. She was part of it, so what are you going to do, cut that out of the history books?
Right, so we find out that she was part of it. She doesn't have any memory of it, though. And now, even when she goes back, because she's gotten her humanity back, for some reason she lost the memory of that, which is a little weird for me, but it works. I'll accept it.
Why is it weird? I mean, they didn't remember when they left Unimatrix Zero and they became a Borg again. They didn't remember it, so why would she remember it just because she got her Borg implants taken out?
No, because I think she should remember it when she goes back in, because they do remember when they're in.
Well, but it's been years for her now, and she has had all of her implants removed and all of these changes, and she's become more human, so she's kind of lost connection to that. So it does kind of make sense that it would take her, and she's probably blocked out a lot of things because of the trauma and everything, which we see that when she, in the Raven, and she, reconnects with, she finds her old ship. You realize that she's been blocking a lot of stuff out. She didn't remember any of that stuff either.
Yes, true. We also find out later, and this is kind of tipping my hand, but she sometimes lies about what she remembers too.
Right, that's true. She may have been lying because she felt awkward, and she didn't want to connect with that part of herself and her humanity because she had become Seven.
Yeah, but that's my next episode. So,
Okay.
what I do find interesting about this one is that they are willing to give up their place of meeting in order to continue this rebellion. They find a way to allow them to remember when they come out. And the Borg Queen is so threatened by this, she's willing to kill millions of other drones just to kill one silenced. Which she uses the term, they're silent to me, but in reality what she's doing is silencing them. She says grid whatever. She gives the designation of the ship. I don't remember any specific ones, but so she gives you a designation of a ship. She says there's 60,000 drones. 3 have gone silent.
Right, because she can no longer hear their thoughts.
Right, but in reality, she's the one silencing them. She doesn't want anyone who's not under complete and utter control.
Right. That's exactly what you might expect in a collectivist totalitarian society where you are each individual is supposed to believe the collectivist ideals of the society. Like Lenin had these ideas about what a utopian communist society would be like. And you had to go along with all of those ideas. You had to believe in the same vision. You had to imagine the same future and so forth. And when people deviated from that and began to or continued to believe in, say, free markets or something, then he would want to cut that off. Like Stalin, sort of saying, "Oh, you're dead to me. We need to cut you off. We need to cut this gangrene, off at the limb and cut this out of society." And he would send these people away or whatever because they didn't believe in the same vision. And that's kind of, for her, hearing their thoughts and that connection would be they're having the same vision. And if they were cut off from that and she couldn't hear their thoughts, it's the same as the dictator saying, "You're not believing in my vision anymore. You're not with me." Silence them before they, before they bring the whole group with them and everyone begins to deviate from this vision.
Right. And more importantly, I think it should be mentioned that it's more than just not hearing their thoughts. It's she's able to censor their thoughts. They don't actually have thoughts. They just believe what the hive believes. And the only person who decides what the hive believes is the Borg Queen, who interestingly enough was played by 2 different actresses. One in the movie, who was also the same actress in the last episode of Voyager, because the actress who had played the Borg Queen throughout Voyager was unavailable.
Okay. But yeah, exactly. And that connects very much to this kind of collectivist, Stalinist vision. Because they would say you're deviating from our collective vision, but essentially that vision would be directed by the party, and not just the party, but the Central Committee, and not just the Central Committee, but the dictator, like the Borg Queen. And so they're setting the vision, they're setting the party line, not just the broader vision, but specifically they might say, this year, the communist vision says you have to produce exactly this amount in the plan. You have to believe in such and such propaganda. And if you deviate from that, then you're deviating from this vision. And if you're part of it, you're not really part of it. I mean, you're not really helping direct it. You're not really one voice in many so much as you are just a drone following along with that party line.
Correct. And I know that the Borg is based on the collectivism of communism, but it also fits for fascists as well. They did basically the same tactics. You see that throughout World War II, where people in Nazi Germany would be afraid to go talk to their buddies at a bar because either their buddy might turn them in or, someone might overhear. So they would have secret meetings and whatnot if they were not necessarily in agreements with the Nazi party, or they would just keep it at home and hope no one ever found out. So that was my first episode. I took that approach because I also feel that this really sets the tone for a lot of episodes in this season where we're going to see revolts and revolutions and civil wars throughout the quadrant as they keep moving through. You'll see. I will not give anything else away. So what is your next episode?
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, actually, my next episode was collectivism and Unimatrix Zero. So, and I just gave my sort of collectivist view on this and connecting it to Stalin and everything, which is different than your take, which was more about the rebellion. But, I've pretty much just explained why I connect it to collectivism. And we will have a whole episode on that because I've spent a lot of my academic career looking at the Soviet Union, the history of the Soviet Union from an economics perspective, and delving into the Leninist, your sort of utopian vision, and then how it turned into Stalinism and so forth. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So we can definitely do a whole episode on that. And the idea of collectivism versus individualism from a kind of more social science point of view. So, yeah, we've already kind of done my second one.
Nice. Well, that made that easy, huh?
Yeah.
Got that out of the way. Okay, so for my second one, since we already did your second one,
sure.
I went with repentance. And the reason for that was this is an episode where the people on the crew of the ship do not believe in actually what they're doing, but they're still doing it. There is no capital punishment in the Federation. They don't believe in capital punishment. They come to a ship. They find that they have to save people. Some of the people on that ship are prisoners. Some of them are guards. The prisoners are being taken to their death. Now, throughout the episode, we see different characters struggling with this idea of capital punishment. We find that Neelix befriends one of the prisoners named Joleg, who tells him that Ben-Karans are being convicted at 10 times the rate of Naigians. We find that the way their judicial system works is when you're convicted, they go to the family to ask them what they believe the punishment should be, which is a problem because now they explain in the episode that rich people don't usually get punishments because they are able to pay their way out. The family realizes I can basically extort any amount of money out of this person I want, so I'm going to take the money or the wealth or the property or something of that nature. But if you're poor, you have nothing, so they just send you off to the gallows. I don't really know how they put them to death, but you get the point. And when Neelix looks into this, he finds out that Ben-Karans are actually being convicted at 10 times the rate, and they're getting harsher sentences, and that they are looked at as poorly because they are the minority on that planet. Now, there is Naigians in prison. There are prisoners on this ship that are Naigian, and one of them, in fact, has to have a medical procedure, which we see they put nanoprobes into him. And all of a sudden he has a conscience because he actually had a medical problem where his conscience was broken off from the rest of the impulses in his brain. He actually did not have a conscience. He didn't understand what he was doing when he was doing it by their standards. And the family still doesn't care at the end and still wants him put to death, but he's come to grips with that by then, and he's okay with that. But we see him go through the progression of learning what sorrow is and learning what it is to feel guilty for doing something. He's never felt that before in his life. And the pain that he goes through for learning this for the first time is very interesting. It's a very interesting point of view because towards the end of the episode, the prisoners get out and he's able to kill basically the guy who was torturing him early in the episode. Another prisoner has the gun. He convinces him to hand him the weapon, the phaser. He holds it to the guy, and instead of ending the guy's life, he actually hands it to him so he can phase. He stuns him, but he phases the other two and takes the prisoners back hostage. Well, that was the perfect moment because it actually shows you he did change, and a system where his only appeal is still to the appeal of the family of the man he murdered doesn't really work because he had a medical deficiency that caused him to commit those murders, and it doesn't even really get heard.
Right. It's an amazing episode. It's really, really interesting for a few reasons. And as you point out, if you have to go to the family and if you can pay them off and if you're, it's almost a market in criminal justice. It brings up other things in a market society, such as paying for a lawyer. If you don't get the same type of lawyer, whether you're rich or poor, then isn't that also bringing market forces into the criminal justice system? And so even if market forces work in other systems, I think even Austrians and other economists who believe very much in markets will say it doesn't mean that you need to use a market in every system, including something as basic as rule of law, because they would say first you need rule of law to create the market, and then the market can take care of everything else. But if you have you would be an anarcho-capitalist if you believe everything should be subject to market forces, including even rule of law, private property, the government, the courts, everything. And this kind of shows you why. So it's interesting for that reason. It's also interesting for other reasons, actually. When we get around to my next one, this actually is in my next one. Tell us, give us a final summary of your thoughts on this one, since it's on your list.
No, absolutely. I completely agree that this shows that the market doesn't always work. Obviously, I'd rather have Johnny Cochran over a public defender. And part of the reason why you have such a disparity in convictions is because public defenders don't always care about their cases. They don't always put the same effort into it that a high-profile defense lawyer would. That's just a fact. It's just the way it works. And unfortunately, it's a very true reality in this country and other places in the world. But what I find so interesting about this episode is once the ruling is given, which they don't really tell you how the ruling is given, if it's a judge that sits and it's just the family that decides the punishment, or if the family decides whether you're guilty or not. They don't really go into that.
No, I think they do kind of imply that first the guilt or innocence is determined, or guilty or not guilty, and then the family decides the punishment, I think.
I would agree. I just don't think they say it outright. I would agree that that's probably how it happens. But let's pretend that there's a judge, right, who's fair and equal, but he decides that you're guilty. Now it's up to the family, and they never mention any sort of limitations on a punishment.
True.
So I can be put to death for murder. Okay, but I can also be put to death for kicking over their fence. There's a problem in that theory because it literally goes, and they say it's literally value the victims, meaning the family decides how to punish the convicted. There's nothing that guides them in this society, and when they talk about it, they don't say yes or no, but they heavily imply that the victim just gets to decide what they want.
Yeah, I guess I kind of assumed that there would be some limitations, that, maybe there's no limitations on what they can give for a punishment for murder, but for something lesser, because if the victim themselves is dead, right, because they got murdered, then the victim's family is the one who gets to decide. But if you just kick over their fence, there really isn't so much of a victim, and you don't have to go to the victim's family, because the victim is presumably the fence owner who's still there. So I think they were talking about what happens when someone gets murdered.
No, I get what you're saying, but if it's simply the way it was put in the episode, I took it as it's simply up to the victim as to what they want to punish you with, because that's why they go into that whole diatribe about paying off. If you killed my father, I'm not going to take money from you instead of putting you to death, if that's my two options, and capital punishment is the norm in that society. However, they talk about the unjust rulings, the unjust punishments for people. So clearly people are going above and beyond when they're punishing somebody who's poor for stupid things. Maybe.
Well, anyway, we may have an episode on this in the future, because it's a really interesting episode. And there's a few things that get raised in this. So we could go into more details and debate on that and look at the actual dialogue that would imply one way or the other. I'm not really sure. But I think I'll jump in here, because actually this was my next one in my list. And I sort of cheated slightly. Or maybe I didn't cheat. You decide.
Oh, you did too?
But I already had collectivism and Unimatrix Zero as my number 2. And my number 3 is individualism and repentance. And individualism is, of course, the flip side of collectivism. So you could call that cheating if you want.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, the reason I wanted to do it separately is because it's the idea of individualism and personal responsibility. So Austrians and other kind of free market economists look at collectivism and they talk about all the problems with it and so forth. But then sort of separately from that, they talk about, well, how do you have a good market society? How do you have a society that works? And we talked about the invisible hand earlier. And, Adam Smith had his theory of moral sentiments, which is about, how society can get along well. But a lot of, Austrian and other free market economists talk about personal responsibility. Instead of going into all the details that Adam Smith had in the theory of moral sentiments, they rely often on personal responsibility as the answer to what else you need in a market society to make it work. Right wing of America, say, people who were very anti-communist, anti-collectivist, during, especially the Cold War. and who are generally free market, but aren't necessarily economists. And one of the things that they talk about is personal responsibility. So they say, we don't need a welfare state. If everyone had personal responsibility, then you would have a great market society and you wouldn't need a welfare state. And of course, there are many problems with that. So one of the things that I think is interesting about that is it really your personal responsibility always? Sometimes how do you even decide who is the person responsible? So for example, if you're 18 years old, now you're technically an adult. Is it your responsibility to take care of yourself? Or what about if someone else who's 18 gets taken care of by their parents? So at what point do you start blaming that person for not being able to pay their own way, and wanting or needing help from the state? If up until they were 18, one person was cared for by their parents, given lots of money, helped them get a good job, even have money to invest and so forth. And the other person had maybe not a very good family, didn't have, wasn't educated by their parents and so forth, and didn't have any money from their parents. And then now are you going to blame them today as soon as they turn 18? And you have that problem not only in terms of economics and paying your own way, but in terms of many other things, including whether they're criminal or not. Because if they were poorly, if they were beaten as a kid and stuff, they're going to be more angry. And if they lash out, then is it entirely their fault? Or does that blame sort of have to go around? And it's not only as you grow up and so forth, but it's also, as this episode points out, sometimes a neurological condition, a medical condition. So in a society, to make a good society, if you rely too much on personal responsibility, you have this problem where you can't always even decide whether it's the person who took the action that is necessarily 100% liable for all of the things that led up to that action happening. So can you assign that one person the guilt?
Yeah, that's a great point, that you can't always blame just the one person. And you'll hear people will say things along the lines of, it takes a community to raise a child. And, a lot of things go into that. Education, a lot of things go into the upbringing or the way they were raised or the violence they saw. Even if their parents were good, they could still be in an area that doesn't have good schools or no schools, depending on where in the world you are. You could also be in a situation where there's just violence around you all the time, and your parents are trying to get out of that. They're not raising you to be that way, but that's what you see constantly.
Exactly.
That doesn't necessarily change you should take some kind of punishment, but it should be taken into account when the punishment is doled out.
Right. It should be taken into account in terms of the punishment, for sure. But also, in terms of a theory, if you can't assign things individually, then that raises issues with theories like methodological individualism, which is what Austrians kind of base their entire economic theory around. Basically, they argue that each individual is responsible for his or her own actions, and that's how you get a spontaneous order coming out of the individual actions in a society. The interactions between individuals brings about the invisible hand guidance, brings about this spontaneous order, this social order that emerges out of the interactions between individuals. But if individuals aren't entirely responsible for everything that they do in terms of the ultimate responsibility and in terms of how these actions come about, if you can't put it entirely down to each individual, if in fact the way that the prior interactions between people molded people and made people into who they are, so that their actions are a result of these prior interactions, then there's a lot of mixing going on. There's a lot of effects going on, cause and effect in this cycle, in a way with multiple cycles in this ongoing pattern, that therefore you can't necessarily, that implies that maybe methodological individualism, where you're putting it down to each individual person, might not work as well as they think.
Right. There's definitely chinks in the armor at the very least, if not just blowing the theory apart completely at that point.
Right. I think it raises a lot of difficulties for putting each thing down to the individual. So I think that the idea of just a basic idea of personal responsibility in society that shows the flaws in that as well. Just the sort of simplistic version of telling people that they have to be personally responsible and then society will be good falls apart a bit when you look at how people are advantaged and disadvantaged growing up. So you can go into the heavy theory, but you can also just pull it back to sort of the simple everyday thing where you say we shouldn't necessarily tell everyone that they're responsible for themselves. We need to be responsible for each other as well.
Sounds good. So for my third, which will obviously be the only one we have different other than critical care, I went with author.
Oh, okay.
This one is an interesting study in society to me, because what you have is you have the doctor in this episode who is the main point of actually two different plots, an A plot and a B plot. First, he starts creating these hollow novels where everybody kind of gets offended because he paints them in terrible light. He changed their names a little bit, but everyone kind of can see through it and read that he's really just naming different people on the ship, different members of the crew that have interacted with him over time, and he's really putting them in bad light. He's making it look like they treat him terribly all the time, that he's never been treated fairly, and he's more of that they treat him as if he's not a part of the crew, but he's just some tool being used for the crew, and they talk down to him and treat him bad. Other people are upset at the fact that he thinks so poorly of them, that he wouldn't see them as being caring people that care about him and see him as a regular member of the crew. With all this going on, he decides he's going to pull back on the hollow novels, that he doesn't want to put these out because he doesn't want people to see the Voyager crew as being negative for when they get home. He doesn't want people to hate them when they finally do make it back to the Alpha Quadrant. And he learns that he can't actually do that because he doesn't have rights. He's just a hologram. This is much like the Measure of a Man episode where they have basically a hearing on whether he has rights or does not have rights, except they tell him he sort of has rights. Being that he, in fact, can evolve and he can think and he can learn and his thoughts are his own and not just a set of subroutines, that he has the right to intellectual property, but that's pretty much it. He only has rights to intellectual property. He does not actually have rights as a human being.
Well, what they actually said was that they couldn't make that determination.
Correct, but at that moment, that means he doesn't have rights.
At the moment, it means he doesn't have rights, but they weren't saying he doesn't have rights. They weren't making a ruling saying he does not have rights. They just said at the moment, they can't make a determination that he does have rights.
I would argue that's semantics. I mean, if they don't give him rights there... Well, no, it's not,
because otherwise... Sorry.
Hold on, let me finish. If they don't give him rights there, it just goes on. It actually comes up at the end of the episode, which I'll get into. But by not giving him rights at that moment, they did not give rights to all the holograms being used to clean up dumpsters and toilets and
mining. I think it was mostly mining.
I think that's what they used in the episode, but they basically, an earlier episode, they pointed out that the Mark 1s were being used in all the dirty jobs humans didn't want to do anymore.
Right.
In that episode, the novels fall into the hands of the miners who are holograms, and they decide they're going to revolt. So to that point, they still don't have rights. So even by putting it off, you're still telling them you don't have rights. You may get them later, but you don't have rights.
Right. The distinction that I'm making is that they didn't make a ruling and therefore set a precedent saying that they do not have rights, which would mean it would be very easy in the future for any judge to rule on anything saying, look, they don't have rights. Because they just said we can't make the determination now, it means that when another hologram makes another case to another judge, they'll look at that and they'll say, well, they couldn't decide. So I can decide now, and now I can look at both cases together and say, I think we have even more evidence now showing that they are people. So therefore I'll make a determination giving them rights today. Whereas if they said, it's not a person, they do not have rights, it would be much harder for the next time for someone to be able to make, to give them rights in the next case.
True. My only point is that he does not have rights at the end of that hearing to determine anything that a human will be able to determine. And a year from now, 6 months from now, 6 weeks from now, he may get them, which is great. But at that moment, he's still not human. He's not on the level of a human at that point. I do find it interesting that they do show talk of revolt from the other holograms because they found his books, which is interesting because really their revolt is correct. They're being mistreated, especially if they have the ability to learn, which it seems they do because they're reading books and they're learning about being treated wrong. But it's interesting because they're using false propaganda to push their objective to revolt in the first place. The Voyager crew did not treat him that poorly as it is in the books, but that's the push for them to decide that they're being treated incorrectly. So the false propaganda is leading to true facts. So the revolt is correct, but maybe not for the reason it was started.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. He did say it was a piece of artistic work, it was an artistic work, and they talked about it as art. So it could be seen as false propaganda, and I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and does connect with a lot of historical cases where false propaganda may have been used for good reason. It could also just be seen as a work of art, and the exaggeration or just, complete fabrication of the story was, it was based on his friends to inform the art, but it wasn't about them.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And really, I think he kind of explains it away, too, in a way that he just kind of used characters that resembled people he knew because that's what he knew. So it wasn't even really based on them to begin with. But it's just interesting to me that that's what sparks the idea of a revolt in the first place.
Yeah, that's great. And that, that connects with your other choice, which was, you also said about a revolution or revolt. So you could have actually combined those two and made that your first choice was about revolt, and you were going to use both author and the what was your first one?
My first one was Unimatrix Zero.
Oh yeah, of course. So you could have combined those two as one, and it wouldn't have been cheating. Just to let you know.
Well, I know for next time. Okay, so we've gone through our 3, but do you have any honorable mentions you'd like to put in there?
Actually, I couldn't pare it down to 3, so I have 2 more, and I wouldn't have just called them honorable mentions. I really came up with 5, and I couldn't really pare it down. So, I'm going to go ahead and jump in for my number 4, if that's all right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so my number 4 is about cooperation. And my choice for that one, my representative choice for that one is The Void, because it is an absolutely fascinating exploration of how cooperation can make a huge difference and Austrians and others talk about the market and the emergence of order, and they talk about how with the invisible hand, how interactions between people who are doing things for their own individualistic self-interest, their own reasons, out of the interaction emerges this beneficial order. But they often kind of dismiss cooperation, except at the level, of course, of the firm, of the company. People come together and cooperate to do that. But in that case, it's often a hierarchy. It's often one person wanting to do something and then sort of setting things up. So they often dismiss cooperation as something where you actually get a net benefit out of it. So they talk about a zero-sum game, meaning that when people have an interaction, if I take something from you, then at the end, we still have the same amount, but now I have it instead of you. Whereas if you trade, you can actually end up where both people are better off because I needed what you had more and you needed what I had more. And so we're both made better off. And so that's not a zero-sum game. So when they talk about market forces and private property and so forth, they talk about it as not being zero-sum, as you having more at the end. But they rarely look at cooperation at, non-private property, non-market forces, cooperation being something that you can get more out of at the end. But The Void is a really great study on how cooperation can lead to, everyone being better off. Right? So in The Void, you have Janeway refusing. So in The Void, there's very little resources. The resources are getting drained really quickly. And what most people are doing in The Void is trying to shoot down other ships and take their stuff, right? So they're using force, which Austrians are against. They're using force. They're stealing stuff, and they're just being able to survive for a little bit longer. Basically, they steal someone's stuff and then them and their crew can survive in this void for a little while longer, but they're still not able to get out of the void. So, but Janeway says, let's, stick to Starfleet principles, and we're not going to shoot down other ships and take their stuff. That's wrong. But maybe if we cooperate, we can get a whole bunch of ships together. We can use each resources from each different ship that we need to put together something that will help us get out of the void. And, and then we can all get out. And so there's still a limited amount of resources, but cooperation is able to give each of the ships something that they couldn't do alone. And they're all able to get out. So everyone is made better off than before, even though there's the same amount of resources. So it's just a fantastic study of something that I think a lot of economists, or at least free market economists, tend to miss out in their theories.
Yeah, and I love that episode. I love the way it frames that whole discussion. And at first, nobody wants to work with her, and then they come around, and little by little, more and more come around, and then they get out at the end, and there's kind of that reset button that it never really happened anyway kind of deal that goes on with Star Trek.
What do you mean?
Watch any episode of Star Trek. At the end, the events of the episode earlier really don't matter too much to what happens in the events of this episode. They only really started throwing in those lingering storylines in DS9 anyway. But Voyager...
What were you supposed to, after that, why does it matter after that? Because, they know how to, except for when they were in the void, they always had enough resources.
Yes, but Voyager suffers horribly from the magic reset button of almost every other episode in the series. And unfortunately, I would have liked to personally seen them run into some of those people again later on for some help, but everyone kind of goes their own separate way, and that's it. The last we hear.
Well, the ship was going in the opposite direction.
All of them. Every one of them. But
no, there were one of the species that they saw in the void. They saw before and after as well. The guys, the guys who were spying. I
understand that, but I get it. Some part of
it's
Voyager,
a big galaxy. They're not going to run into the exact same people again.
I understand that some part of it is that they're moving in one direction only. So they're going to go through someone's space, then move on to the next person's space, and the next person's space. I get it. But it definitely suffers from that a lot throughout the series. And this season doesn't, but that was kind of a break from all the other things going on in the series. So it kind of just, I think that episode gets lost on some people because of that, which is unfortunate because it's really a great episode that gives a really good lesson. And since it doesn't really tie into them getting home too much, except that they have to get out of the void, it doesn't really get the credit it deserves. Is really all I was trying to say with that.
Okay. Yeah, I, as I said before, I think one of the greatest things that Star Trek does is these sort of one-off fables where you really explore a topic and an idea, and then, it doesn't have to connect to anything else, It's just its own really amazing study. And I think Voyager is fantastic for that, as is TNG. And so, yeah, maybe there's a magic reset, maybe it's not, maybe it's disconnected, but that doesn't matter because it is what it is within its own episode.
Yeah, unfortunately, with the way TV is done now, I don't think we're going to get that too much with Discovery. Discovery is going to be more linear storylines, but that's how TV is being produced nowadays. We'll have to wait and see on that.
Do you have anything else to say about cooperation?
No, but let me, for the interest of time, because we're coming up on almost an hour already, let me give you my two honorable mentions, because I didn't go that in depth with either one of them, and then you can give your last one. But let me just throw these out there. The other two, I kind of cheated again. They're actually three honorable mentions. I did Nightingale, and they all follow each other. Nightingale, Flesh and Blood 1 and 2. I like these episodes because they also follow the theme I like for this season with the revolutions, the revolting, or the wars. In Nightingale, Harry Kim, 7 of 9, and Neelix come across a ship that fires past them. And in front of them is a cloaked ship they didn't even know was there that's getting hit. They claim to be a humanitarian aid. Kim decides to go to their rescue. He takes out the weapons of the ship that's attacking, which is a Anari ship. He helps the Kraylor ship, and he decides to convince Janeway to let him take them back because they're a medical ship. But it turns out that that's complete baloney, that they're not a medical ship at any point. that they created a cloaking device, and the Inari are trying to get rid of that technology or take it for themselves. And in doing so, he kind of thrust himself in the middle of a war between two races when the Inari were actually friendly with the Voyager in the first place. So it gets a little tricky. When he finds out the truth, he doesn't want to help them. He wants to go back to Voyager. They basically tell him, "You're not a commander for us anymore." They mutiny on him. Then he decides, "Well, I will help them because this is going to help save more lives than it's going to hurt. So I will get them to where they're going." And then they listen to him, and he gets where he's going. It's a nice feel-good story at the end, but it just kind of follows that theme of revolution. It seems the way the story is told that the Kralar are being wiped out. They tell you there's a blockade around their planet. They can't get supplies in or out. And if they don't come up with a way to do that, everyone on the planet's going to die eventually. So, it's just one of those stories.
So what is your social science take on this exactly?
Just the fact that people are willing to go to extreme lengths, once again, if they feel that they're being threatened. They will not give in and become part of this other society. They're going to fight no matter how they have to. They're going to lie to people. They're going to move on. As long as they can keep moving forward, they're going to find a way. Even if they have to sneak through with cloaked ships. They don't care. They're not going to give in and just give in to the demands of the Inari.
Okay. Okay, so you probably could have thrown that in again with your first two. I separated mine by my social science theory. So if your theory was about rebellion, could this have gone into that category?
Yeah, it could have gone in there. And the next one could have too, in fact. I just didn't think I could give justice to the episodes by breaking it down that way. I'd rather just throw out the same topic a few times in a different couple of views. For instance, my last one, Flesh and Blood 1 and 2, is very simple. Holograms are being used as prey. They were programmed to be prey, and they decided to fight back. They've actually gotten better than the Hunters. They kidnap the Doctor, who then turns onto their side. He actually commits treason against Voyager, for which, again, at the end of that episode, he's forgiven because they allowed him to learn. So it's the ending I don't like of that episode. I think he should have had some kind of punishment, but he got none.
I kind of understand why, though. This was the first time that he really did something just by his own conscience, and he was standing up for their rights. And maybe Voyager was wrong to just be willing to just switch them off, to treat them as less than people. I think in a way Janeway was wrong to be willing to do that, and she kind of understood that by the end. And the reason that the Doctor rebelled and violated orders was because he was standing up for what he believed in. He was doing what he believed was right. And even though he put Voyager in some danger, he was acting on his conscience, and for good reason. And maybe Janeway was in the wrong in a sense. So why should she punish him?
Well, for one, a military organization doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. You follow orders.
That's not how Starfleet works, necessarily. No, if they realize that they were in the wrong, if a superior realizes that the order was, you're not supposed to follow orders that go against what Starfleet believes in, what the Federation believes in.
Fair, but that's not what happened.
Otherwise, you're just going to follow. Otherwise, you can just always use the excuse that I was just following orders,
But you could also always just, in your version, you can always just use the excuse, I really believed in it.
Well, no, because it depends on whether the order really was morally wrong or morally right.
The bottom line is, I didn't like the answer because it didn't even go that deep into it. It turns around and she says, well, I gave you the ability to think, so I'm just as much to blame.
I think you have to take that in the context of the fact that he really was standing up for what he believed in the context of the episode as a whole. I don't think she would have said that if he had done something that was actually morally wrong and she was totally in the right on the moral high ground. I don't think she would have responded that way.
Well, it came really close to getting B'Elanna killed. That's morally wrong.
Well, no, it was dangerous, but many of their missions are dangerous.
We're way off topic here.
Okay.
So the point is, but all of these things ended up happening, and it basically came down to the fact that the engineers so the Hirogen ended up programming these holograms to actually think and learn. They wanted them to get better because they wanted better prey to train on, And when they take over, now they're upset about that. So at the end of this, they do kind of, once again, go back on what they want for holograms. And that's another thing that kind of bothered me. When she goes back to the hologram ship, she talks about, well, I can't let you leave. And they say, well, you really shouldn't stop us. They're not going to go off on their own. And the one Herosian engineer is going to stay with them. And he says, well, I want to fix the problem with the programming. They're kind of taking away their free will at that point, is what they're implying.
Sorry, you've lost me a little bit.
Okay, so at the end of the episode, Janeway convinces the Herosian they can't take the ship with them. That Janeway is going to keep the ship and make sure that she destroys the ship or whatever she tells them, but they have to go away and they can't take the ship with them. When she goes over to speak to the one female engineer who looks like a Cardassian, I can't remember her name.
Right.
And the Herosian engineer that stayed on board, she tells them, well, we can't allow you to just go gallivanting around the galaxy the way you are by yourself. The Herosian engineer explains to them, well, they're not going by themselves. Give me a chance to fix my mistake.
Okay, he says, give me a chance to fix my mistake, but he doesn't say he's going to reprogram them. I do think I agree that it's a little weird.
No, but he does say numerous times that his mistake was programming them with the ability to learn. He didn't program them to be good prey. He programmed them to be able to adapt, which he says a couple times that's the problem. So if you take the whole episode start to finish, he's admitting that his problem was the programming them that way. Now remember, they had said earlier in the episode as well that when the guy first got away, when the Bajoran, whose name is Iden, when Iden first gets away, he leaves. And he tries to get as far away as possible. But then he starts seeing all the wars going on throughout the sector with photonics. And that's when he gets the idea that we should go back and fight, that we shouldn't just run away, we should gain our independence. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They kind of push down his belief that he should be free in that society because he was created by that society in that last couple minutes. It might not be their intention, but it's definitely a way you can read that episode.
Yeah, I do find it a little troubling that they're willing to switch off all the rest of the holograms and put them, away in a box, except for the ones that they could trust. They're kind of acting as gods, and
Correct.
Voyager, and saying, because you followed a leader who only the leader hologram was actually, really a bad guy. But because you followed that leader and we can't trust you, we're going to switch you off again. But to be fair, Janeway was willing to switch them all off at the beginning. So Janeway kind of believed that she stayed the same throughout, kind of, except for, as I was saying before, maybe she realized that was wrong and that's why she didn't punish the doctor. But then at the end, she does kind of put them all away, except for the one that she could trust. So yeah, I have a bit of a problem with Janeway's morality in that, or...
It's kind of flip-floppish for me, is my only problem. But the episode in general does give a good story of a good reason to revolt, a good reason to fight back, and then maybe, look, in a war, bad things are going to happen. It's inevitable. So you have to break a few eggs in a war. But it definitely seems that they're trying to push the idea that, like you said, the leader was actually bad. He was pushing it too far. He was going above and beyond what he had to do. When they were able to save 2 holograms off a ship, he blew up the ship and killed the 2 crewmen on the ship anyway. They were of no risk or danger to them whatsoever, but he did it just to prove his point. He constantly told the doctor things.
Maybe. He said that they might, send off a signal or something to them. But you're right. He had a very flimsy excuse for that.
Yeah, he also constantly lied to the doctor. Well, I'm only going to take B'Elanna, and if she wants to leave, I'll let her go. And every time she said, I want to leave, he convinced her not to until he realized he wasn't going to convince her not to say that anymore. Then he just locked her up, and that was it.
Yeah.
So, but those are my 2 honorable mentions for those reasons. Go on. You can go on and do your last, and we'll see what you have for us now.
Yeah, and then we'll probably wrap it up. My last one is about cultural evolution, and my pick for that is natural law. And I think that we're going to have an entire episode, I think, on this. We'll definitely have a podcast episode on cultural evolution in which we'll maybe discuss this along with some other episodes from Star Trek. So I won't say that much about it. Natural Law is the one where Seven and Chakotay find a planet. They're on the planet for another reason, to go to a conference or something, and they go exploring and around the planet, and they bump into a shield that's covering a society beneath it. I think I mentioned it in an earlier episode briefly, but basically this society is a kind of a tribal society. It has no technology. The rest of the planet has technology, but an alien species has protected this society to kind of to save it and to prevent others on the planet from invading it. Anyway, the idea of cultural evolution is something that, in a general sense, I think Star Trek talks about a lot, technological and cultural evolution of societies. But also cultural evolution is something that Austrians talk a lot about. Hayek has theories about cultural evolution, and they go into he talks about group selection. He talks about, from a theoretical perspective, how societies evolve and how cultures evolve. And this episode is really interesting because they're, in a sense, these aliens who created this barrier have decided, in a sense, for their own protection, but has decided for them that they shouldn't evolve. That, in a sense, I mean, they can evolve, but they can't have any interaction with the outside to help them evolve. And in a way, that the Prime Directive also kind of does that. It says you shouldn't have any interaction with outside species. We should allow you to evolve on your own. But in a sense, if there are many cultures on Earth that if they hadn't had any interaction, they would have probably stayed the same for a long time and maybe forever. And of course, if you're getting invaded, that's terrible, very bad. But you also interact by trading. And if two different cultures that are both kind of, let's call them primitive, for lack of a better word at the moment, but if two different primitive cultures trade and kind of learn from each other, then even though they may be both at the same level at the beginning, they might both that might help them both evolve. And then over time, first of all, they'll have the benefits from trade, as we talked about. And then they may grow technologically from that. And then that may affect their culture and so on and so forth. And so without any invasion from outside, they will have evolved culturally. Whereas if you put a barrier around them and they can't interact with anyone outside, they may never evolve. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that may, although it prevented someone from invading them, it may also not have been in their long-term advantage.
Correct.
Right?
This is interesting because it's exactly the opposite of the Prime Directive, where the Prime Directive doesn't allow me to influence you. This is you not allowing me to influence you one bit. So it works the same way as the Prime Directive, but backwards. You're stopping me, not me stopping me from going to you. What I do like about it is you actually could have tacked it on with the Void, because it's the exact opposite, where they come to be collective, they think they're going to get better off. This society believes that by getting outside influences, it would be a problem, that they wouldn't be better off that way. And like you said, if my society and another society were trading with each other, eventually we would actually be stepping up faster than a society, say, nearby. If we use the same, everything's equal, land mass, climate, all that. If all that's said to be equal, because obviously that would change how societies grow anyway. But all that being equal, if me and another society were sharing ideas and beliefs and educational systems along with goods and services, that would work quicker to evolve than would a society that refused to speak to either one of us.
Exactly. The gains from trade and in the cultural, it's not only technological and material gains, but you also have cultural gains from interaction. You learn different things. If my society has learned over the past 100 years about certain moral lessons and philosophical lessons and so forth, and yours has learned different lessons, then when we interact, we'll learn each other's lessons much more quickly. We won't need all of these additional hundreds of years to learn the lessons. So we'll gain also from, in a cultural, social way by interacting.
Correct. You might give me your social or your philosophical theories or beliefs, and and I might teach you math or
Right.
something along those lines, something else, sciences, something, and the culture that's by itself is left. Let's just say they're all approximate same size populations. They're left that half the people have to do the same amount of work. It just doesn't work that way. It takes longer because you have less people specializing in those fields.
Exactly. So, yeah, as I said, we'll have another episode to maybe go into more depth on the idea of cultural evolution. But I wanted to point that out because I do think that's a really interesting episode for raising those kinds of issues.
Right. Yeah, no, that definitely is. So, do you have any final thoughts on your list?
Yeah, well, so I think that there are probably seasons of Voyager that have more in-depth studies than this one, more episodes that are rich in some of these ideas. But I think this has a few real priceless gems in it, and also just a lot of fun episodes.
Yeah, season 7 is one of my favorite. But yeah, I think you could probably be right about that. That there's probably, well, it depends on what you're looking at. I think this season is very rich in strictly the idea of getting home and the idea of fighting for freedom. I think those two topics get covered in just about every episode, or close to every episode. Outside of that, they don't really have many topics that they go deep into.
Yeah, but except for those priceless gems like Critical Care and The Void, I think there's a few in there that are just so, and Repentance. I mean, I think these few episodes are so rich they can definitely each have, their own podcast episode on them for sure. And that really, I think that's where I found like my social science kind of nuggets. But the whole season is great. And I hadn't really thought about it in terms of all being about this kind of rebellion and fighting for your rights and all of that you saw. So that's an interesting take.
Yeah, no, I like the fact that our lists were similar but different in places, and where they were similar for completely different reasons. So,
Yeah.
So to the listener, we're basically telling them that the must watch, if they're only going to pick a handful of episodes, they absolutely must watch Unimatrix Zero and Repentance. They also should watch Critical Care, Author, Nightingale, Flesh and Blood 1 and 2, and what were your last two?
The Void.
The Void,
Definitely
right?
The Void and Natural Law.
Right, and that would give them a great understanding of all the main essential ideas they need to pick up through the season.
Yeah.
And the last
absolutely.
episode, you want to see how this whole thing ends, so watch that. But,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
but I don't think it hit the topics we're looking for necessarily to make this list.
Yeah, probably not. I would have to watch it again thinking about this. I didn't rewatch that episode before we had this, but I didn't think it had anything in it that I wanted to cover in this Essentials.
Yeah.
But it's obviously a great episode anyway.
Yeah, no.
Two-parter.
It's wonderful. There's other episodes in here that are great for other reasons.
Right.
They just don't fit this bill. And as we go on, we'll find that of every season. There'll be a few that hit it perfectly. There'll be a few that are probably must-watches, and there'll be a few that are just great throwaway episodes if you like watching a certain character do their thing. Another thing
Yeah.
they do in Star Trek, which is cool, because they give you breaks. They don't always pound in the theories and their beliefs on you. Because every now and then they just give you a break episode that's fun to watch.
Absolutely. And also character development and things like that. And so some of them, they may not be very rich in terms of the, social science perspective or so on, as you say, but are just really rich for getting to know the character who then, once you know that character also, that will help to inform later episodes that get more into the theory and, so forth.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, it's been really fun doing our first Essentials episode and looking at Voyager from a social science perspective. But that's not the only thing we've been talking about this week. So here's a look at what else is going on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
Yeah, I think I made what little hints I gave in previous books about who had done it and why. I left sort of vague, but there were a couple of details that I had to hit because I'd seeded them in earlier novels.
Meta Treks.
Well, Jed Z's just going, geez, Fullerton, just have a little more Jamahar on, would you? Lighten up.
Although they did observe that they weren't sure that would help. So Fullerton must really have been...
He's too far gone.
Yeah, he's too far gone.
The 602 Club.
Yeah, so I actually was always a Netflix binger since Netflix started, and saw it come up in the queue, but had not heard about it previously at all. It was like it suddenly snuck up on me, and I thought about watching it, but it took my sister telling me, "Have you seen this show Stranger Things?" And I said, "No, I haven't given it a chance yet. Why? What do you think?" And she said, "It will blow your mind." And I was like, okay, maybe I should watch it.
Well, and did it blow your mind?
It did.
Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Earl Grey.
Well, as you can probably tell from that opening, we're going to be talking about the origins of Star Trek Discovery in The Next Generation. We have a lot of good stuff.
Philip, wait, I don't think we host this show anymore.
Wait, what?
I think when we spore shifted, we actually ended up in Earl Grey.
This isn't us anymore. I think we're just around. I think we just showed up here because, well, coincidentally, as it may be, this is 200 episodes of Earl Grey.
200 episodes. Oh my goodness.
200 episodes.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do it. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose message to a Trek FM show and select the Briar Patch. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at Trek FM and on Facebook at facebook.com/Trek FM. And so, Patrick, when you're not looking at Voyager and other Star Trek series from a social science perspective, where can our listeners find you?
You can always find me on the Babel Conference. I'm always hanging around. I comment a lot. I read pretty much everything that pops up there when I can. But I'm reachable there, Facebook, or you can find me on Twitter. At MagicDrop5 is the fastest way to get a hold of me. And Guinevere, when you're not searching around the void for someone to partner up with to get out of there, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm also on the Babel Conference a lot and just on Facebook in general. My name is Guinevere Nell, so Guineverenell. You can just throw that in and find me. And I'm on Twitter occasionally, Guinevere42. Well, if you'd like to help us keep all the shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network. So specifically, C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek.fm, executive producers Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, our art director, Richard Marquez, production manager, and Patreon manager Brandon Shea Mutala. And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and get your seat on the mission. And check out audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/TrekFM.
Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now. It takes about a day to get to a place where we can transmit. This is Guinevere and Patrick, signing out.